The World Development Report is an annual flagship report of the World Bank. This is the 46th report in an annual series, and every year the topics that are discussed range on a specific development topic. This year, we felt it would be very important to talk about growth prospects in middle income countries and the challenges that many middle income countries face in moving from middle incomes to high incomes. And this report was launched in August of 2024, and we had the great privilege of having early presentations of the report in Korea. And many of the ideas in the report are motivated by the Korean experience. The report itself has a lot of roots that are European. The picture in front of you is of Joseph Schumpeter, who in 1942 wrote this really incredible treatise called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And there he said, the way for the market economy to grow is for incumbents and market leaders to face the process of competition. And there you had the processes of creative destruction. Those with new ideas would be able to come, develop, expand, and grow, and take out those who are resisting change. So we have used a lot of Schumpeter's ideas in developing this report, and I think you will see from the various countries you're in that when I tell you about what we did in using Schumpeter's ideas, you may see greater resonance in your countries. Now, typically the World Development Reports that we publish are often just documents, right? But they're not very useful to practitioners and policymakers such as yourselves, because taking a global report to a country context requires a lot of distilling. So, friends, I'm very happy to tell you that that over the summer of 2024, we had a really good growth academy at the University of Chicago, where we had noted professors like Philippe Aghion, Michael Greenstone, Jim Heckman, Michael Kremer, many of them winning Nobel Prizes in economics. They came, spoke to us about the broad ideas. And we had invited think tanks and policymakers from about 35 countries. So now that you are here in this audience, I would like to tell you that we have the new editions of this Growth Academy, one in Europe being planned in Romania for May, and one in Egypt that's being planned for April. So if anyone has interest in these Growth Academies, do reach out to us and we'll be happy to provide you with the relevant information. So let me tell you the big story. The big story is that middle income countries today are home to most of the people in the world. They're home to 6 billion people. And all these middle income countries have set themselves up in a race against time. Their leaders, like you saw in Korea previously, have aspired to become high income in one generation or two. And this, what we're finding is that the external environment today, both in terms of trade, in terms of other policies, are not making things easier, but in fact making it harder for these middle income countries to reach their aspirations. Second, to escape the middle income trap, to avoid the slowing down of growth, countries need to go through two transitions, not one. The first is to take global ideas and use them efficiently at home, the process we call infusion. And once they have done really well at that, they need to think about innovation. But these changes of growth strategies and transitions are not automatic. Now, to grow quickly through these stages of income, we find that middle income countries, they need to discipline incumbents that are market leaders. They may be elites in society. I think the moderator and others would know things like this happening around the world. And they need to reward merit, particularly the merit of women, and capitalize on crises, because crises are often great opportunities to trigger change when when the status quo is getting pretty well established. Now, here's a chart that many of you should think about. Middle income countries today are a big and they're growing part of the global economy. they account for 3/4 of the global population. So if you see low-income countries at just about 9%. So this is 3/4 of the world's population, but they have only 40% of the world's GDP. There's a real problem there. And they also are about 63% of the people who live in extreme poverty. But what's particularly surprising is that the majority of carbon emissions today are coming from middle-income countries, not high-income countries that have often been leaders in terms of the climate transition. So in all these countries, and there are about 108 of them today, their leaders are planning huge strategies to become high-income countries in one generation or two. The picture in front of you is of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was the leader of China in 1978 when China opened up its economy and liberalized with the rest of the world. And at that time, Deng said, to get rich is glorious. And when he said so, he let the genie of aspirations out of the bottle. That's driven huge, tremendous progress in terms of incomes and welfare in China. And today, China has aspired to become a high income country of $35,000 in the next 20 years. In countries like India, the prime minister has a very big vision of India to becoming a developed nation by 2047, the centennial of its independence from the British Empire. Similarly, if you look at South Africa, you look at Vietnam, you look at Nigeria, you look at Egypt, all these countries, the leaders have set themselves in these vision documents a race against time. They want to become high incomes in one generation or two. Yet, friends, reality is very different. While to get rich is glorious, to get rich is very hard. And what we find is that the per capita income of middle income countries relative to the US has stagnated, not recently, for the past 50 years. And here, the chart that you see in orange, the line, is showing the ratio of middle income country incomes relative to the United States. And what you see, the number has never, ever risen more than 10%. So while there are all these kind of broader sayings that middle income countries are doing well, the catch up to the United States is not very fast. And you may ask right now, and you may think, why is he talking about the United States? That's because to most of the world, the United States is the frontier, the economic frontier. And that is because there are only 25 million people in the world who live in countries that are richer than the United States. Now, what we also find in our research is that over the last 34 years, there are only 34 middle income economies that have become high income. Some of them were lucky. They found oil and they timed their policy changes to kind of on the backs of high commodity prices. But many, and 30, about 21 of them, were in the right place. They became part of the European Union. And the European Union, in all its policies, provided great access to capital, to incentives, to great access to markets, and all these kind of countries benefited from that. Then there are a few others, those like Korea, that were neither lucky nor in the right location. They were plucky. That means they put in the hard work and the effort to use their investments and savings to propel growth. But they quickly changed growth strategies as the returns from the traditional growth strategies died out. So it's in fact for the majority of you who are not from the European Union and not from the oil exporting countries, lessons from Korea on how to become high income are absolutely critical. In fact, after reading the WDR, senior leaders in Korea had a big seminar on how Korea could kind of think about telling the rest of the world in what the main lessons were. And if you were to look at these charts, when it's not only the maps, you will see the only 34 economies that became high income in 34 years had a very small combined population, just 250 million people. That's just the population of the country of Pakistan. And now what you see is that all these countries that are sort of joined middle income ranks, but have found it very hard to transition out of middle income. So I'm going to tell you about three stylized facts about middle income economies. First is that growth slowdowns are normal, they're to be expected, and there's some bad policies that make them come faster. Second, middle income economies are stuck in structures that are no longer useful for them. And just like Korea shed these structures to do well, middle income economies need to do the same thing. And finally, middle income economies are going into these shrinking spaces by fragmentation of geopolitics, of broader trade barriers, and such. This is a chart that shows that slowdowns are much more likely in middle incomes. The bar on the orange is for middle income countries, and there we see that a middle income country is 3 times as likely to have a slowdown compared to a high income country. But then that's not the only story. If that middle income country has poor institutions, sort of the way Nobel Prize winner Daran Acemoglu talks about, they're poor institutions, they have weak economic freedoms. These sort of slowdowns come in much more earlier and they last much more longer. Second is that what we have found is that middle income countries typically have a structural stasis. That means they have less capital and they use capital less efficiently. So this bar in front of you in blue shows you that if capital accumulation were enough, per capita incomes in middle income countries would be about 71% that of high income countries. But it's no more than 1/5. The reason is that not only while middle income countries are getting enough capital, it is the efficiency in use of capital that's really problematic. And this is seen in country specific data. You look at Pakistan, you look at India, Indonesia, China, Paraguay, Brazil, Ukraine, Chile, and Poland. Let's look at Brazil, for example. Brazil has capital output ratios that are about 90% of the United States, yet its incomes are like 22%. Now, take a country like Indonesia, which has investment per to output ratios that are close to 80% of the US, and they only have GDP per worker relative to the US as 20%. So there's a huge structural problem in these economies. And then, finally, to make these things even worse, today's middle income countries are growing, facing stiffening headwinds in the global economy. Wealthier economies, we are finding, are putting in more protectionist policies, and especially when you look at large economies like the US, Canada, and in the EU, their trade policy measures are in fact blocking many middle income countries from accessing global markets. And today, after COVID, most developing countries are incredibly severely indebted than ever. Right now, what we find after COVID, debt to GDP ratios are close to 200%. And friends, you know what this really means is that these countries pay so much in debt servicing that it becomes challenging for them to pay for infrastructure and education and all the important things that are good for these countries. So this is a very kind of depressing outlook. So let me tell you what is the solution out here. The big point we make in this report, and I think all of you should try to appreciate, is that middle income countries need economic sophistication. What we did is we carefully looked at all countries that made transitions from $3,000 per capita in PPP to about $50,000. And what we found is that the thing that matters the most is economic complexity, is the sophistication of what they produce and trade in global markets. Now, how do you get sophisticated? And the big idea that we have in the WDR is that as economies get economically complex, the growth strategies need to become complex as well. So the first transition, friends, I think it's very important, is that you can't rely only on investment. You have to include infusion of global technologies to investment, as Korea did in the 1980s, to be able to grow faster. That's because the returns to investment diminish very quickly. The extra dollar you spend on schools or you spend on infrastructure after a level of spending gives you only 10 cents to the dollar. Now, what do? You have to bring in new technologies from the rest of the world and invest and add to investment. Investment remains important, but you have to have infusion of global technologies. The second transition is when the returns to infusion start dropping, you need to bring in frontier innovation. And again, when you look at countries like Korea, Korea moved from an infusion state to an innovation state in a very planned manner. It did not sort of try to do it too quickly. Let me show you an example. And this, friends, is one of my most favorite examples about Korea. The picture in front of you is about engineers who used to work for Samsung in the 1970s. At that time, Korea was a low middle income country, and it was trying to improve investment. Yet, Samsung and all these large companies thought it might be much better for Samsung to get technologies from abroad. So these are the first set of engineers who went from Samsung to NEC in Japan. And they started learning about technologies on how to build televisions, radios, transistors. And this is what the first ever license looked like between Samsung Electronics and NEC in Japan. So they were allowed to license the technology and use the know-how. So remember, it's not only technology, it's technology and know-how, and use it to produce in the global market. Now let's see what happened. To allow these sort of transitions to take place, the Korean government helped. First, it gave subsidies to enterprises like Samsung to infuse Japanese technology and train their own engineers. So the line in the blue shows infusion. But very soon, the Japanese companies found that the Koreans started building up these technologies, competing with them in Asian markets and global markets, and outcompeted them. So now the Japanese got really worried. So they just started increasing the cost of licensing. They made it harder for Korean engineers to access Japanese technologies. At that time, the Korean government worked again with the companies and said, it's time to switch from infusion of global knowledge to coming up with our own innovations. And that's the sort of brown gold line that you see climbing up. So while infusion subsidies go down, innovation subsidies start going up. And over time, now, if you look at the world patenting data, Korea, my friends, is one of the top countries in the world that patents new technologies. It's all because of a government that worked hand in hand with companies to examine the global economic landscape and enable its companies to compete in that global economic landscape. So I was very, very impressed with the whole Korean experience. But it's not only Korea who followed that strategy. If any of you are from Europe, I'll tell you a European story about Poland. Poland was coming out from the middle of a planned economy. They were kind of transitioning to a market economy. And they too followed a strategy where they first infused Western European technologies and started using it in their own factories. And by that, today, Poland has an income per capita that's 50% of the European Union, and it was 22% when it started the transition in the early 1990s. But what really allowed Polish firms to do well was the government helped and created the economic environment for even the state-owned enterprises to feel the pressure of the market. So if the state-owned enterprises were not doing well, they were not bailed out by subsidies. They had to meet the market test. This is exactly how the chaebols in Korea were made to meet the market test. And over time, Poland, like Korea, spent a lot of money on education, not only primary education, but secondary education. And the benefits to the Polish economy happened when, as soon as they integrated to the European Union, there all this migration from Poland to the rest of Europe because they had people with skills and they were sending remittances back to allow Poland to develop. So these are stories we have found around the world. You look at Chile, you look at countries around the world, and this is sort of a strategy that it's first investment, then add infusion to investment, and when the returns of infusion drop, you add innovation to it. But then there are some countries, I don't know if anyone's from Brazil, like countries like Brazil, who decided to take a different path. They wanted to innovate right up front rather than going through the hardships of infusion. And the Brazilian government gave enormous subsidies to Brazilian firms to come up with new technologies. The problem was the way they set up the performance system was that if you file for a patent in the Brazilian patent office, you get access to finance. The limitation here was that the Brazilian patent office had very little information to know what a good idea was and what a bad idea was. So it was kept giving patents and the firms kept getting money. Then rather than what happened in Korea, where the large corporations were faced to compete in global markets, Brazil protected its firms with a tariff on foreign goods. So this meant that while enterprises were growing in Brazil, they were producing knowledge that nobody really wanted. And so now what you see, the Korean line of per capita incomes in blue, or labor productivity going from 20% of the US to close to 65%. At the same time, Brazil is going from 45% to 25%. That's a very different growth strategy these two countries use. So how do you sort of do these changes in growth strategies? What we found is these are not automatic, but take a lot of effort in terms of designing policy. So what we introduce in the report is that these countries need to balance the economic forces of creation, of preservation, and destruction. And largely what we find is that creation is not a big problem in middle-income countries, but it requires injection of capital, talent, and energy. The biggest problem in middle-income countries is preservation. That is inertia that limits competition, that limits contestability, and this is often encouraged by the state. And what we also find is that the forces of destruction, the one Joseph Schumpeter called the gales of creative destruction, are really weak, but often they're crises. And countries that use crises well are able to engineer social and economic change. And friends, this is exactly what Korea did when the financial crisis hit them in 97. They used that as a way to discipline firms that were not performing and encourage new firms to come up. So let me give you what I mean by the story of efficiency. So this is on the left, a chart, let me show you, about the growth of dynamic enterprises. And what we see in a country like the US and gold is that a firm starts small, but over time, if it does well, it's productive, it gets more resources, better capital, better labor, and it keeps growing. So after 40 years, the average firm in the United States is 8 or 10 times the size it was born. This is called the up and out dynamic. On the other hand, in countries like India, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Vietnam, even after 40 years, these firms are no more than twice the age or twice the size when they was founded. Clearly, this is a huge inefficiency problem. And what we find is that all these productive firms are really held back from growing in countries like Kenya, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Peru, Romania, Bulgaria. There are all kinds of frictions and constraints for productive firms to grow. Some of them are access to finance, some may be access to land, but often it is government regulations that make it difficult because governments only love to support small scale industry. They have no idea of how to support dynamic industry. So these are big issues. So there's huge problem in the efficiency of capital. The second problem that's really big is the efficiency in allocation of talent. The reason is that middle income countries need a lot of diverse skills. So if you're a low income country, you probably have 5 to 10 occupations that the majority of your labor force works on. But now, if you're a middle income country, the number of jobs and the sort of jobs the economy needs expands dramatically. So you need more diverse skills, but many people from many backgrounds who are not elites are not provided opportunities to acquire these skills. And if you acquire these skills, you don't have the opportunity to use them in the labor market. And what we find is that social mobility is one of the biggest issues right now that is hindering growth in middle income countries because it discourages families from moderate income families from investing in their children's education and accumulation of talent. Again, here, friends, we need to look at the Korean experience because Korea early on made sure they had universal primary education. They quickly got on universal secondary education. They made sure women were treated and educated just as well as men. And over time, when Korea's growth started, the share of women in the labor force dramatically increased. In most middle income countries, that is just not the case. Finally, there's a lot of inefficiency in the use of energy. What we find is that in most middle income countries, the state-owned enterprises that dominate coal power, while the private sector leads in modern renewable energy. And what's really bothersome in middle-income countries is even access to energy. Firms reporting outages are about 20% point more in middle-income countries relative to high-income countries. And yet, for the little energy they do, the energy intensity of middle-income countries, that is the amount of energy needed to produce a unit of output, is about 2.5 times higher in middle-income countries than in high-income countries. So not only do you not have reliable energy, for the energy you have, you use it very inefficiently. So all these countries are using capital inefficiently, the talent inefficiently, and energy inefficiently. So we really need to have a way of thinking where we change the metrics of how we think about policy issues, not only looking at firm size, where governments try to coddle small firms, but look more at value added. We don't only look at static measures of inequality, but in fact add to it dynamic measures of social mobility. And we need to stop looking at sources only of energy and look more at energy efficiency and emissions intensity. So what we have done in the WDR have provided a simple framework. And the simple framework is such that middle-income countries in general need to maintain a pretty healthy balance between the forces of creation, when new ideas come in, the forces of preservation, those that are holding down the status quo, and the forces of destruction that are important to trigger change. So right now, what we find, the biggest thing in middle-income countries is to discipline incumbents. whether they're market leaders through better competition policies, whether they're elites in society through better fiscal and other kinds of political policies. And this really allows newcomers in the economy and society to really add value. But they also need to reward merit, especially the merit of women, to strengthen the forces of creation. And finally, capitalizing on crisis to aid the destruction of outdated policies. So since we're at KDI, I'm going to give you one example from Korea as I end the presentation. So Korea, for a long time, its growth model was dominated by large corporations, and these were called chaebols that all of you probably know very well. And these chaebols had an important role in the economy because they helped Korea compete with other countries in the global marketplace. Yet, often the chaebols became way too important, and the Korean government struggled on how to regulate and how to discipline them. So when the Asian financial crisis hit in 97, and that was something that the Korean government used to discipline these chaebols, rather than bailing each one out through soft loans and fiscal transfers, what they did was let a lot of the large chaebols exit the market and just had to declare bankruptcy. One of them is the Daewoo Group, which was once the second largest conglomerate in Korea. But those of you who are younger probably have never heard of this corporation. What this also allowed is for Korea to bring in new startups and new enterprises and trigger in a whole new generation of economic growth. So Korea really capitalized on crisis to trigger economic change. So for all of you who are from middle-income countries, I think the task of making our countries grow fast is like making miracles. This is a picture of Professor Bob Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics on his work in economic growth. And one of his most famous papers is called Making a Miracle, where he talked about the growth of Korea, a dramatic transformation of the country from middle income to high income in 25 years. But for today, I think most of our countries, if they can do in 50 years what Korea did in 25, that would be a great achievement. And I think for them to make these miracles, they need to follow the policies of disciplining incumbency, of rewarding merit, and capitalizing on crises. Thank you, friends. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and look forward to your questions.